My son, David, told me he was taking me to church, but he left me standing at the gates of Oak Hill Cemetery. He turned to me, and his eyes weren't the eyes of the little boy I raised. They were as cold and grey as the tombstones behind him. "This is where you belong now, Mom," he said, his voice flat. "It's time for you to be with Dad." Friend, before I go on, let me ask you, would you do me a kindness? Tap subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It helps me see just how far my story reaches. He helped me out of the car, his touch feeling like ice on my arm. Then he got back in, locked the doors, and drove away without even a look in his rearview mirror. I just stood there in my Sunday dress, holding my little purse, watching the car that held my only child get smaller and smaller until it was just gone. The shame washed over me in a wave so strong my knees felt weak, to be thrown away like a piece of trash by my own son. The world was silent except for the wind rustling the leaves. I was all alone, and I knew in my heart this wasn't just a cruel joke. This was a plan. But why? What could I have possibly done to deserve this? The sun started to dip below the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that felt like a bruise. A deep chill settled into my bones, the kind that has nothing to do with the weather. I tried to walk, but my church shoes kept sinking into the soft ground. I stumbled past names carved in stone, names of people who were loved, people who were mourned. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" But only the silence answered me back. Despair is a heavy blanket, and it was starting to smother me. I truly believed I would die here, that my son David would get his wish. Just as I leaned against a cold marble angel to catch my breath, a man's gruff voice cut through the air. "Hey, the cemetery's closed." An old man in work clothes carrying a shovel was walking toward me. He had a tired face and eyes that looked at me not with kindness, but with suspicion. This was George, the groundskeeper. "What are you doing out here all by yourself, ma'am?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel. He didn't look like a saviour. He looked like a man who wanted nothing more than to go home. Would he even listen to me or just see another problem at the end of a long day? George, the groundskeeper, must have seen the terror in my eyes because he sighed and led me to his little office, a small shack that smelled of dirt and coffee. He sat me in a rickety chair while he called the town sheriff. A young officer named Miller arrived a few minutes later, his face full of polite concern. "Ma'am, we've called your son," he said gently. "He's on his way." He put his phone on the desk and switched it to speaker. My son David's voice filled the tiny room, but it was a voice I didn't recognize. It was smooth and dripping with fake worry. "Oh, thank heavens you found her, Sheriff," David said. "She's been getting so confused lately, wandering off. I was just about to call you myself." I felt the blood drain from my face. He wasn't just leaving me to die. He was telling the world I was crazy. He was erasing me, making sure no one would ever believe my word against his. The officer gave me a pitying look, and I knew right then that David was winning. My son was building a cage of lies around me, and I had no idea how I was going to get out. What happens when your only child, the person who should protect you, becomes the monster you need protection from? The ride home with my son David was the quietest 10 minutes of my life. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word. The man who had just lied to the police with a perfectly smooth tongue was now as silent as the graves he'd left me in. When we walked into my house, the home my husband Richard and I had built, it didn't feel like my own anymore. David walked me to my bedroom and I saw it immediately. A new shiny brass lock had been installed on the outside of my door. He had turned my bedroom into a cell. "You need to rest, Mum," he said, his voice empty of any warmth. "Don't cause any more trouble." Later, I walked into the living room and felt a new kind of cold. The walls were bare. He had taken down all the family photos. The picture of my wedding day, the photos of him as a little boy on his first bicycle, all gone. It was like he was trying to erase our family, to pretend I was just some old woman he had to take care of, not the mother who raised him. I was a stranger in my own home, and my own son was my warden. How do you fight back when the enemy holds the key to your own front door? That night, I lay in my bed, but sleep was a million miles away. The house was dark, but my mind was wide awake, replaying every cold word, every dead-eyed look from my son, David. Around midnight, I heard voices from the living room. It was David and his wife, Sarah. They were whispering, but their whispers were sharp and angry, like the sound of tearing paper. I crept out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard Sarah first. "It didn't work," she hissed. "She's back. I told you that was a stupid idea. You have to be firmer, David, or everything we've worked for will be gone." Her voice was like a whip. David mumbled something I couldn't hear, something weak and tired. "Don't you go soft on me now," Sarah snapped back. "We are too close." It hit me then. I had been so focused on David, on the betrayal of my son. But this wasn't just him. His wife, Sarah, was in this just as deep. Maybe she was the one driving the whole thing. They were a team, and I was their project. What had they worked for that was worth destroying a family? The next morning, I pretended to be sleepy and confused, just like the woman my son David described to the sheriff. I ate the breakfast Sarah put in front of me without a word and went back to my room. I let them think their plan was working, that the fight was gone out of me. As soon as I heard their car pull out of the driveway for work, I went straight to David's home office. The room used to be my husband Richard's study, and it felt wrong to be sneaking around in it. I expected to find papers about my house, maybe my will or bank statements showing their greed. I opened the top desk drawer and shoved a pile of mail aside, but underneath, I found a thick stack of envelopes held together with a rubber band. They weren't from a bank. The letters were from a private lender, someone I had never heard of, and the words inside, they weren't polite requests, they were threats. The letters spoke of a huge debt, a shocking amount of money that David owed. My heart stopped. This wasn't about my small savings or my little house. My son wasn't just greedy. He was terrified and deeply trapped. Who was this person he owed money to, and what had my son done? Holding the threatening letters, I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I needed help, but who could I trust? My mind went to Martha, my neighbour for 40 years. Martha sees everything. While my son David and his wife Sarah were in the backyard, I hurried to the kitchen phone, my hands shaking. I dialed her number, praying she would answer. "Martha, it's Eleanor," I whispered. "Listen, I can't talk long. How is your garden doing?" For years, that was our code. "How is the garden?" meant, "I'm in trouble." Martha's voice was sharp with worry. "Eleanor, I knew it. I knew something was wrong over there." She didn't even pause. "There's a fancy black car that comes by late at night after you're asleep, sits at the curb for a few minutes, then leaves. And a man I've never seen before has been to your door twice. He doesn't look friendly." I felt a chill run down my spine. The man from the letters, the one David owed money to. He wasn't just a name on a piece of paper, he was close. He was watching my house. The cage David and Sarah had built around me suddenly felt a whole lot smaller and a whole lot more dangerous. The very next day, my daughter-in-law, Sarah, came to my room with a small cup of water and a new pill. "The doctor said you need this for your anxiety, Eleanor," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It will help you calm down." I knew better. I looked at the little white pill and felt a knot of fear in my stomach. I pretended to put it in my mouth, but when she turned her back, I tucked it into my sleeve. I was not going to let them drug me into a fog. Later that afternoon, I made my move. I let out a loud cry from the living room. "Oh, my hip! I think I slipped." David and Sarah came running. They couldn't risk me getting really hurt. It would look bad for them. They had to take me to the doctor. On the way home, David stopped at the pharmacy to pick up my prescription. While he was paying, I hobbled over to the counter where my old friend Mr. Gable was working. I secretly showed him the pill from my sleeve. "Frank," I whispered. What is this? He looked at it, and his friendly face turned pale. He leaned in close and quietly said, "Eleanor, this is a heavy sedative. Do not take this. This could make anyone seem out of their mind." They weren't just trying to control me. They were trying to make me disappear right in front of everyone's eyes. Back in my house-turned-prison, Sarah was dusting the living room with a furious energy. It felt like she was trying to scrub away any trace of my life, of my memories. As she wiped down the mantel, she accidentally knocked off the large silver-framed photograph of my late husband, Richard. It crashed to the floor, the glass shattering into 1,000 tiny pieces. "Oh, clumsy me," Sarah said, but she didn't sound sorry at all. It felt like she had done it on purpose, like she wanted to break the last good thing I had. "I'll clean it," I snapped, getting on my knees before she could. My hands trembled as I picked the shards of glass away from my husband's smiling face. As I carefully removed the cardboard backing from the broken frame, a small yellowed piece of paper fell out. It was folded into a tiny square. I opened it up. It was a receipt for a safety deposit box. The strange thing was, it was from a bank in the next town over, one I never knew Richard used, and the date on the receipt, it was from the last month of his life. My dear husband had a secret. What was in that box that he felt he had to hide, even from me? Holding the secret of the safety deposit box, I knew I couldn't stay in that house another day. My son, David, and his wife, Sarah, were not just holding me prisoner. They were actively trying to harm me with those pills. I had to get out. I waited until they were busy in the garage and made one more hushed, frantic call to my neighbour, Martha. "Martha, I have to get out of here," I whispered. "I have a plan. But I need you." I explained it to her quickly, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Tomorrow morning," I said, "I'm going to cause a distraction, a little one. I'm going to let a dish towel get too close to the stove burner. It will make a lot of smoke." I could hear Martha's sharp intake of breath on the other end. "When you hear the smoke alarm," I continued, "I need you to come running over. Insist on taking me to your house to get me away from the fumes." It was a crazy, dangerous plan. So many things could go wrong. But it was the only way. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. I was no longer just a victim. I was fighting back. The next morning, the air in the house was thick with tension. I waited until David was on the phone in his office and Sarah was in the laundry room. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely stand, but I walked into the kitchen and turned on an electric burner. I laid a dry dish towel right next to it, close enough to feel the heat. It felt like an eternity, but soon a thin curl of smoke began to rise, smelling bitter and acrid. Then the smoke alarm started screaming, a piercing shriek that shattered the morning quiet. David and Sarah burst into the kitchen in a panic. "Mum, what did you do?" David yelled, grabbing the smoking towel and throwing it into the sink. Just then, as if on cue, Martha came rushing through the back door. "Good heavens, Eleanor!" she cried, playing her part perfectly. "The smoke! You poor thing, you must be terrified. Let me take you over to my place to calm your nerves." David started to protest, but with the alarm still blaring, he was flustered. He didn't want the fire department showing up and asking questions. He just nodded, and Martha wrapped an arm around me, leading me out the door. As we walked across the lawn, I took a deep breath of fresh, clean air. I was free. But for how long? Inside Martha's warm, cosy kitchen, the whole story came pouring out of me. I told her everything: the cemetery, the lies, the pills, the threatening letters, and finally, the receipt for the safety deposit box I'd found in the broken picture frame. Martha listened, her face growing harder with every word. When I was done, she didn't waste time on tears. She just poured me another cup of tea and said, "All right, Eleanor. A receipt is one thing, but where in the world is the key?" My mind raced. My late husband, Richard, was a careful man. Where would he hide something so important? Then it hit me. The shed. He had a small workshop in the backyard shed that he kept locked. his own private space. No one had touched it since he passed. We walked out back, the smell of sawdust and old paint greeting us as Martha opened the door. We searched through dusty cans and old tools until I spotted his old metal tackle box. I lifted the lid, my breath catching in my throat. There, nestled amongst the fishing lures, was a small, strange-looking brass key on a plain silver ring. We had found it. We had the key to my husband's last secret. Now I just had to pray that whatever he had hidden would save me, not bury me for good. The next morning, my friend Martha drove me to the bank in the next town over. The building was old and serious, with big stone pillars out front. My hands felt like ice as I held the small brass key. Inside, I showed the bank manager the receipt and my husband Richard's death certificate. When he saw Richard's name, a sad, knowing look passed over his face, and that scared me more than anything. He led us into the vault, a cold room that smelled of old paper and steel. The silence was deafening as he slid out a long metal box and left us alone. With trembling fingers, I put the key in the lock and turned. The lid was heavy. I lifted it, my heart pounding, expecting to see stacks of money or hidden bonds. But the box was nearly empty. All that was inside was a single thick book with a dark leather cover, a journal. It was my husband's handwriting on the first page. As I started to read, the image I had held of my dear, perfect husband for 50 years began to crack and fall away. The man who wrote this book was a stranger to me, a man with a dark and terrible secret he had carried all on his own. I sat in the passenger seat of Martha's car in the bank parking lot, reading my husband Richard's journal while the world outside moved on. The journal told a story from 30 years ago, about a business deal and a construction site. There had been an accident, a bad one. A man was hurt permanently. Richard wrote that he was terrified, not of jail but of the shame, of the scandal destroying our family and our name in our small town. So he made a deal. He would pay the injured man's family every single month to help them and to ensure their silence. My hands started to shake as I read the name of the family he had been paying all these years. It was a name I knew as well as my own. Henderson. The family of Mr. Henderson, the kind, smiling man who lived just 3 houses down. The man who brought me a casserole after Richard passed away. The man who always had a friendly wave for me when I checked the mail. The kind neighbour I had trusted for decades was the very person holding the secret that was now being used to tear my life apart. My whole world tilted on its side. Who was this man, really? I kept reading Richard's journal, my eyes flying across the pages. The last few entries weren't for him. They were a letter, written to our son, David. My late husband confessed everything, the shame he carried, the fear he lived with every day. He explained that the debt of silence was not fully paid. He begged David, as his son and the new man of the house, to please continue the payments. "Don't let this shame tarnish our family's name," he wrote. "Make it right, son. It's your burden now." And just like that, I finally understood. My anger toward David, that hot, burning rage, began to cool into a sad, heavy pity. He hadn't inherited a comfortable life from his father. He had inherited a secret, a crushing weight that he was too weak to carry. The threatening letters made sense now. Mr. Henderson wasn't just collecting a quiet debt anymore. He was a predator who had found a new, more scared victim to torment. David's terrible cruelty toward me, his own mother, wasn't born of greed. It was the clumsy, panicked act of a drowning man, trying to push away the one person who might see him go under. When Martha drove me back to our street, everything looked different. The familiar houses, the neat lawns, the big oak trees. It all seemed like a perfect mask hiding something ugly. As we pulled up to Martha's driveway, I saw him. Mr. Henderson was in his front yard, carefully trimming his prize-winning roses. He looked exactly like he always did, a harmless, retired old man in a straw hat. He saw me in the car, and his face broke into a wide, friendly smile. He gave me a big, cheerful wave. My blood ran cold. That wave wasn't a greeting. It was a message. It was a boast. He was telling me, without saying a word, that he had all the power. That smile was the cruelest thing I had ever seen, because I now knew the monster hiding behind it. This man, this pillar of our little community, had been tormenting my family in silence for 30 years. My fear began to burn away, replaced by a cold, hard anger I hadn't felt in my life. I was done being scared. I was done being a victim. My son may have locked the door, but this man built the prison. Back in the safety of Martha's kitchen, I finally understood the whole horrible picture. My son, David, was in a prison too. It wasn't a room with a lock on the door like mine. It was a cage made of fear. After my husband Richard died, Mr. Henderson must have seen his chance. He wasn't just collecting a debt anymore. He was a blackmailer, squeezing my son for every penny, likely threatening to twist Richard's secret and ruin David's life completely. David's monstrous acts, leaving me at the cemetery trying to drug me, they were the desperate moves of a man terrified of the monster down the street. He was trying to control the one person he could, me. He was afraid I'd find out, or that I'd say something to someone that would make his nightmare even worse. Knowing this didn't forgive what he did, but it changed everything. My enemy wasn't just my son. My son was a puppet. The real monster was the man everyone in town loved and respected. How could I possibly fight him? It was my word against the kindest man in town. I had never felt so alone. After a long night spent staring at the ceiling, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't fight Mr. Henderson without David. I had to turn my jailer into my ally. It was a terrifying risk, but it was the only path I could see. The next morning, I picked up Martha's phone and dialed his number. When he answered, his voice was tired and wary. "What is it, Mum?" he asked. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I used a voice I hadn't used since he was a teenager who had just broken curfew. It was calm, steady, and left no room for argument. "David, it's your mother," I said. "We need to talk, not in the house. Meet me at the diner on Main Street in 1 hour." I paused, letting the silence hang in the air before I added the final, most important words. "Come alone." Before he could argue or even answer, I hung up the phone. My heart was hammering in my chest. I had no idea if the son I raised was still in there, or if he would just run straight to his master. My entire future now rested on what he did next. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth at the back of the old town diner, a place that hadn't changed in 50 years. I stirred my coffee with a shaky hand, my eyes fixed on the door. Right on time, my son, David, walked in. He looked awful. His shoulders were slumped, his face was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He slid into the seat across from me, the silence stretching between us like a rubber band pulled tight. I didn't say a word. I just reached into my bag, pulled out my husband Richard's leather journal, and placed it on the sticky tabletop between us. "I know, David," I said, my voice quiet but strong. "I know about the payments. I know about Mr. Henderson." That's all it took. The fight just seemed to drain out of him. His face crumpled, and he started to talk, the words tumbling out in a broken whisper. He told me how Henderson's demands grew from money to signing over deeds to our property. He admitted that his wife, Sarah, was terrified of losing everything and had pushed him to control me. "He has us trapped, Mum," David finished, his voice cracking. "He's going to take everything. There's nothing we can do." I listened to my son's despair, but I refused to let it swallow me too. "Your father was a smart man, David," I said, leaning forward. "A careful man. Are you absolutely certain that journal is all he left behind?" David frowned, thinking. For a long moment he just stared at the table. Then his eyes widened a little. "There is something else," he said slowly. "Another book. It's not a journal like that one. It's just a ledger." He described a simple green accounting book. In it, our father, Richard, had written down every single payment he ever made to the Henderson family. For 30 years. Every date, every amount, and sometimes a small note next to the entry. "I hid it," David admitted, his voice full of shame. "I thought it was proof, a record of our family's guilt that Henderson could use against us." A fire lit inside me. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. "Oh, David," I said, my voice suddenly clear as a bell. "You've been looking at it all wrong. You think this book is a record of our shame. It's not. It's a record of his crime." We had a weapon now, the ledger, but we were still just an old woman and her broken son. Mr. Henderson was a respected man. Who would believe us? We couldn't go to the police. Then I thought of the cemetery and the man with the gravelly voice and suspicious eyes. George, the groundskeeper. He was an outsider, a man who didn't seem to care what anyone thought. We found him locking the gates at dusk. We stood there between the world of the living and the dead, and I told him the whole story. I showed him Richard's journal and the green ledger. George listened without saying a word, his face like stone. When I was finished, a grim look settled on his face. "Henderson," he grunted, the name sounding like a curse. "Years ago, my family owned a small farm just outside of town. A slick businessman in a fancy suit came along and pushed us out, bought our land for pennies on the dollar." He looked right at me, his eyes hard. "It was a much younger, but just as rotten Mr. Henderson." A slow, bitter smile crossed his face. "I'll help you," he said. "And I know the perfect place to make sure the whole town hears the truth." "The annual church picnic," George the groundskeeper said, a grim smile on his face. "It's in 2 days, on the town green." I must have looked confused, so he explained. The picnic was the biggest social event of the year. The whole town would be there. And the master of ceremonies, the man who would stand on a stage and speak to everyone, was none other than Mr. Henderson. He was always the star of the show, shaking hands and accepting praise for his generous charity donations. He would be surrounded by the very people whose respect he craved more than money. It was the perfect stage for his downfall. "I don't go to these things," George grumbled, "but I know people who do, old-timers, folks with long memories." His plan was to make a few quiet phone calls, to plant a few seeds. He wouldn't tell them what was happening, just that they might want to come see their old friend Mr. Henderson put on a special show this year. Our plan was set. We had only one chance to do this. If it failed, we would be ruined, and Henderson would hold all the power over us, forever. There would be no second chances. The next 2 days were the longest of my life, filled with a buzzing, nervous energy. We met at Martha's house, a little team of unlikely soldiers. Me, my nervous son David, my tough-as-nails friend Martha, and our new grumpy general George. The plan he laid out was simple, but it made my blood run cold. George got a tiny microphone, a wire that he would tape to David's chest, hidden under his shirt. My job was to approach Mr. Henderson right before he was set to go on stage. I had to look weak, defeated. I had to pretend I was there to surrender. "You have to bait him, Eleanor," George instructed, his eyes serious. "Make him feel proud, make him gloat, get him to say what he did." My role was to be the harmless old woman he thought I was, to lure the monster out into the open, while the hidden microphone listened to every single word. The morning of the picnic, I put on my Sunday best. It was the same dress I had worn that awful day my son left me at the cemetery. This time, though, I wasn't a lamb being led to the slaughter. I was a hunter, and I was walking straight into the lion's den. The town green was overflowing with happy families and cheerful noise. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and barbecue. It was a perfect picture of everything Mr. Henderson had worked so hard to control. He was standing near the decorated gazebo, looking like the king of the town, shaking hands and laughing. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I took a deep breath and walked toward him, leaning on a cane Martha had given me for show. My son David followed a few steps behind, his face pale and slick with sweat. I waited for a moment when Henderson was alone. "Mr. Henderson," I said, making my voice tremble just a little. "Please, I'm not here to fight." He turned, and his smile was thin and cold. "I know everything," I whispered, holding up Richard's old journal. "I have the ledger. Just leave my son alone and I'll give it to you. We can end this." He looked from the book to my face and then to my son's terrified expression. A low, cruel laugh rumbled in his chest. He thought he had won. He leaned in close, the smell of his cologne making me sick. He was ready to gloat and I was ready to listen. Mr. Henderson leaned in so close I could feel his breath on my cheek. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of pure contempt. "That old book?" he scoffed, sneering at the journal in my hand. "That book is worthless. It just proves your husband was a guilty coward. And your son David, he's just as weak. He was so easy to break, so terrified of being found out." His voice was a low, venomous whisper, meant only for me, but every word was a drop of poison. He thought he was whispering his victory speech into the ear of a defeated old woman. He was even willing to get rid of his own mother to save himself. He gloated. Then he delivered the final, cruelest blow. "Leaving you at the cemetery? That was my idea. A perfect way to make everyone think you'd lost your mind before we put you in a home for good." He finally said it. He admitted to the heart of his cruel plan, so sure of his power that he couldn't resist rubbing it in my face. He had no idea his own pride was the bait he was swallowing whole. Just as the terrible satisfaction settled on Mr. Henderson's face, a voice cut in, shaky but clear. "You're wrong." My son, David, stepped out from behind me. He was no longer cowering. He looked Mr. Henderson straight in the eye. "I didn't do it for you," David said, his voice growing stronger. "I left my mother at the cemetery because it was the one place I knew you couldn't get to her. It was the only place I knew she would be safe from you." Henderson's smug look began to falter, confusion clouding his eyes. "I called George the groundskeeper before we ever left the house," David continued, the words rushing out now. "I told him an old woman would be there looking lost and to call the sheriff right away. It was a stupid plan, a horrible plan, but it was the only thing I could think of to get her away from the house you were about to steal, away from the woman you wanted to drug into silence." In that moment, the ugliest thing my son had ever done was reframed. It wasn't an act of pure hate. It was a desperate, twisted, and terribly clumsy act of love. Mr. Henderson stared at David, speechless. And in that silence, my son did the bravest thing I have ever seen. He calmly unbuttoned the top of his shirt, revealing the small black microphone taped to his chest. At that exact moment, across the green, George the groundskeeper, who had been lingering by the sound equipment, flipped a single switch. A loud crackle echoed from the speakers on the stage, silencing the entire picnic. Then, Mr. Henderson's own voice, his slick, whispering, hateful voice, boomed across the crowded lawn for everyone to hear. "Leaving you at the cemetery. That was my idea. A perfect way to make everyone think you'd lost your mind." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The happy chatter stopped. People lowered their hot dogs. Children stopped playing. Every single eye in that park turned to the gazebo, to the man they all respected, as they heard him confess to a cruelty they couldn't imagine. The old-timers George had invited started murmuring to each other, their faces dark with old memories. Mr. Henderson stood there, frozen, trapped in the spotlight of his own evil words as the silent judgment of the entire town fell upon him. As Mr. Henderson's recorded voice faded, leaving a ringing silence, an old man near the front of the crowd stepped forward. It was Mr. Abernathy, a man who had lived in town his whole life. He pointed a shaky, wrinkled finger at the man on the stage. "Henderson, you're a liar!" he shouted, his voice cracking with an ancient anger. The whole town turned to look at him. "My father worked on that construction site with Richard's partner," he declared. "It wasn't Richard's fault. The man fell because you were the contractor and you were too cheap to pay for safety railings." The final, ugliest truth landed like a thunderclap. My dear husband, Richard, hadn't been covering up a shameful mistake. He wasn't guilty of anything. He was the first victim in Mr. Henderson's long and cruel game. Henderson had framed an innocent man, then spent the next 30 years bleeding his family dry over a crime that he himself had committed. The crowd let out a low, angry murmur. Henderson hadn't just been a blackmailer. He had been a monster hiding in plain sight, and my family had been living in the shadow of his lie for my entire marriage. There were no police sirens, no dramatic arrest. Mr. Henderson's punishment was quieter and far more complete. He just stood there, surrounded by the cold, silent stares of the people who had been his friends and neighbours moments before. The respect he had built his entire life on crumbled to dust at his feet. In their eyes, he was no longer a pillar of the community. He was a ghost. That public shame was a prison far stronger than any jail cell. Later that evening, David and I sat in my living room. The house was quiet and it finally felt like mine again. He had spent the afternoon putting every single family photo back on the walls. He turned to me, his eyes full of a pain that was now his own, not something inherited from his father. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I am so sorry. For everything. For what I did. Can you ever forgive me?" I looked at my son, my broken, foolish and brave son. The path ahead would be long, but for the first time it was a path we could walk together. "Yes, David," I said, reaching for his hand. "We can begin." A few weeks later, life had found a new, quiet rhythm. One Saturday, David and I decided it was finally time to clean out his father's old shed for good, to let the last of the ghosts go. As we cleared out a dusty corner, we found a small, locked metal box we had never seen before. Inside, there were no more secrets about debts or lies. Instead, there were letters, dozens of them, written by my husband Richard to his own father, who had been gone for years. He had poured all of his fear and loneliness onto those pages, detailing the horror of being trapped by Henderson's threats. I wept as I read, realizing my husband had never been weak, just terribly alone. In the very last letter, we found something else, a warning. "Henderson's greed runs deeper than our troubles," Richard had written. "It has roots all over this town in deals and promises no one knows about." David and I looked at each other. Our nightmare was over, but I had a feeling the story of our town and the secrets buried within it was just beginning to be told.